why do you think those superordinate challenges of climate change, pandemics, disasters, even maintaining the East Asian political economy and so forth, why are they not providing that sort of necessary stimulus to collaboration? And the second question, which kind of in a way flows from this as well, which is that, in your mind, is it better to try and get a new great power bargain between some of the players, or should a prerequisite be to actually deal with the history problems and the deep-rooted kind of conflictual history they have and the sense of victimization on all sides, as a sort of a prerequisite for actually getting them to focus on some of the wider goals and ways in which they can move out of a competitive relationship into a collaborative one?
I think if we take the first part of the question first, because I think these are two quite different questions. So the first question first about, why superordinate challenges haven't managed to spur the kind of cooperation we might have hoped to see between China and Japan. I'd be a bit careful about making that claim, I suppose. I guess I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I would say that, yes, we have seen certain superordinate challenges within, the region that have spurred, bouts of Sino-Japanese collaboration and cooperation. The most prominent example, of course, is, the Asian financial crisis, and looking at, particularly monetary cooperation. We tend to forget these days because, financial crises are not currently fashionable, but the Chiang Mai initiative type of regional safety net type of arrangements that arose out of regional disillusion with Western powers, around the time of the 97 Asian financial crisis, when East Asian states pretty much felt that they'd been left in the lurch by most international financial institutions and Western economies. China and Japan did manage to, cooperate and reach agreement on a number of regional lending and backup facilities for economies in crisis. So that's one example of a period in which they did manage to do something. And at various sort of functional type of levels, the plethora of what are called non-traditional security areas in which the two countries have been able to coordinate and cooperate to some degree. So I mean, I wouldn't say that it's been a sort of unrelieved landscape of antagonism and competition between them. We're not, of course, seeing the types of coordination and cooperation that we certainly need to see in the face of ontological security threats of the kind that Barry is describing, which I totally agree with, in the realm of climate change and threats from the consequences of climate change. But we're not seeing that degree of cooperation amongst any great powers, not just the US, not just China and Japan. So they're not particularly distinguished in not being able to do that, either. So without, disagreeing with you, I'd just say it's a more mixed picture than might appear at first glance, and the problems that bedevil the very meta level types of problems, systemic threats that we've got today, are similar to the impediments that any other great powers seem to face in reaching some sort of accord on costly cooperation that's necessary. Coming to your second question, Kevin, on this issue of the relationship between reaching some kind of understanding about managing the history problem, relationship between that and reaching a new great power bargain between China and Japan. In the book, we argue that historical memory is both intrinsic to the socio-normative aspects of great power bargains and a key arena for contesting mutual identities and rules of the game. So it's both an intrinsic attribute of a great power bargain and an arena for contestation. So I think this means that we can't really think about, oh, let's deal with the history problem first before the great power bargain, for example, as though, the history problem were a discrete thing standing separate from the great power bargain. In part 3 of the book, we show that, really the intensity of the history problem between China and Japan has waxed and waned, right? After 1945, despite the constant fact that there was no direct peace settlement between China and Japan. Now that naturally means that there are intervening variables, right? That make the history problem more of a problem at certain junctures than at others, right? Now, I'm not trying to say that the history problem is superseded by more important independent variables like power distribution, or geopolitics. I'm trying to say that our analysis show, I'm trying to say what our analysis shows, which is that there have been ways and there are ways in which the great power bargain can help to mediate or manage, right, or regulate the intensity of the history problem between China and Japan. So it is a bit of a sort of convoluted answer to that question, but I think it's actually quite important to see the sort of interconnected nature of the history problem and the great power bargain. Now, in the scenarios which I sketched just now, we show different possibilities, right, of the history problem acting as a facilitator of certain scenarios, certain types of outcomes, but it can also act as a roadblock that needs to be removed, right, in certain other scenarios. With this sort of bland summary being that obviously the most explicit management of the history problem will be necessary in the scenarios which most directly require China and Japan to reach, the tightest form of collaboration, which then requires the most exhaustive types of mutual understandings to be negotiated on fundamental, what we call constitutive issues. Again, that's just a very brief summary. Look, there's no sort of easy way through this, right? In many ways, the history problem, if you like, begins life as a domestic problem, right? It rarely begins life as an international or bilateral problem, right? And in this case too, certainly, we don't do that in a lot of detail in this book, but I dealt with it in my 2013 book, trace the origins of the most recent bout of the history problems in the 1980s between China and Japan, back to Japanese domestic politics, right? And the sort of irreconcilable differences between the left and the right, the progressives and the conservatives within the Japanese system was what essentially led to the, intra or the domestic disputes about history in Japan spilling over into regional reactions to that, right? And there's multiple examples of this elsewhere in the region as well. If you think about, of course, the one that we all know very well, the domestic pressures in China that have been created deliberately or inadvertently by the patriotic education campaign, right? Now, of course, creates both an instrument and a risk for the CCP, right? That is hard to put in a box, right? That sort of domestic political pressure on the Chinese Communist Party, to toe its own patriotic and nationalist line is hardly, an asset at times, and this is pretty obvious. We can see this. So it's both a problem as well as an instrument. And if you look at Korea as well, don't forget that the recognition of the plight of ex-comfort women in South Korea was not the result of the South Korean government suddenly seeing light. It was quite the opposite. It was the result of social groups and social campaigns that prevailed despite official reluctance and indeed repression, right, of the issue. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I don't think it's likely to be a case whereby governments bring their domestic constituencies into the agreement of bargain. It could well be the opposite, that it's domestic, and social pressures and constituencies that might oblige, the particular governments to respond appropriately. And in this regard, we've not even talked about constituencies with great vested interests in Sino-Japanese relations that have been prominent in the recent past. I'm thinking about business groups and other sorts of entrenched economic interests that have been particularly influential on the Japanese side vis-a-vis China policy, particularly in the post-war period as well. Now, these things are all in flux, of course. And so it's a long way for me to come around and say to Hugh that, I do agree with you that a lot of the sort of fine-grained answers to the questions that Barry and I want to ask in this book reside in the domestic realm. And as Barry and I have both said this in multiple rounds, to reviewers and also to people who've kindly given us questions to the book, we really think that this is a really fertile ground that needs to be explored in a separate book by, country and regional specialists who are, very much better placed than we could be as international relations scholars, to explore that really important domestic site of contestation there within each of these countries.